Next Radio 2018 with Broadcast Bionics. Next Radio.
Thank you very much. My name is Kary Stewart. No one here needs to be convinced about the power of audio. As a journalist, audio gives us an incredible opportunity to record the subtleties that give the listener the space to visualize and time to respond. In environments where people have gone through trauma or change, much of the work of an audio reporter involves simply listening. Listening and then projecting real empathy with the interviewee and their plight. And if you can establish a connection and then capture the rawness of the situation, you can consequently tell the story authentically. And the question for me with covering these issues is not how I do my job, but why. I'm Peruvian by birth, and I have a special interest in South America. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how my experiences in the regions have taught me that often the value of the work comes in unexpected ways. El Salado is a tiny town in Colombia, and in 2000, the Colombian paramilitaries conducted what was to be the country's biggest ever massacre. Over 100 inhabitants were murdered. During and after the massacre, the villagers fled to the capital and nearby towns, but in 2010, NGOs started working with the community to bring them home. At the time, I ran a small radio charity called Fair Tunes, and we wanted to help. It's not an easy place to get to, and Fair Tunes was a tiny grassroots organisation, and resources were limited. So in the end, we built 4 walls, put a roof over the top, put in some donated equipment, and called it a radio station. That was enough. I taught the children basic radio skills. I worked with many of the adults who some went on to run the radio station. There was no internet available, and so the community thought up ingenious ways of getting their message heard and the programs heard around the village. And we also hosted their programs on Mixcloud as well. It was as lo-fi as you can get. But the lo-fi aspect of the whole thing didn't matter. The important aspect was that it gave some of the people who had suffered this terrible atrocity and this trauma a chance to be heard. For many, it was the first time they had spoken about what had happened. And for others, it was the first time that their families had heard them speak about what had happened. And the children also got a chance to hear their parents and their elders tell their stories. My experience in El Salado was an important reminder that the work is not just about getting aired widely or reaching a mass audience, but it's the message and the process that happens in the recording of the message, particularly for the subject themselves, that can be where the benefits are. As a Western reporter, I try very hard not to have preconceived ideas of what I think that the community I'm visiting needs, or which side of the story is the right one, which is the side of good. And this was very much the case when I was sent by the Guardian Global Development Desk to cover child labor in La Paz in Bolivia. Let me be clear, I'm not talking about child exploitation, slavery, the sex trade, etc. I'm talking about the children who I went to meet working in the streets. Mainly they were shoe shiners. But it still seems obvious, doesn't it? Child labor, it has to be wrong. It must always be wrong. But when I went there, I met a lot of children who came from rural areas where they had been taught to contribute to the family from the age of around 5, and it was something that was considered culturally acceptable. And the reality was that for the children I met selling on the street or shoe shining, it was the only way they could stay alive. Without that income, they and their families would simply starve. The stigmatization and condemnation of child labor without addressing the cause has meant that the children have become completely marginalized. They have very little legal protection or rights. And to add insult to injury, this marginalization has meant that the rest of Bolivian society shuns them and looks down on them. The shoe shiners wear masks so they cannot be identified. They're afraid their school friends or even their extended families will reject them. And it was only through a trusted source that they would speak to me at all, and only because I assured them that I would not be using a camera. As a Western reporter, there can be a tendency to think that we have the answers. But it's people living the stories we capture that have the real story. And it's in the subject telling their own story that I believe lies the present and the future of audio journalism in development and human rights. When it comes to this field of reporting, our job is to be there, once again, to be the listener and to give people a safe space to tell their stories. Of all of the podcasts I've made, none have captured the real story in a more gritty and harrowing way than the series I produced for Amnesty International called Cuban Lives. But for most of the recordings, I wasn't even there. The stories were captured by Amnesty Mexico soon after Obama repealed the wet feet, dry feet policy, which allowed Cubans to gain asylum a year after reaching American soil. The interviews were never intended for broadcast, but for written use in research by Amnesty, and therefore there needed to be little thought around the quality of the recording. So you think smartphone on the table, busy cafe, restaurant in a crowded area, and you get the idea of how bad the audio actually was. Ultimately, the miniseries was revoiced by actors in the UK, but in terms of the content, they worked because the recordings were so unfiltered. The audio that was recorded was relatively unstructured and a very real conversation, with not even the distraction of a microphone or a recorder. And the idea of letting people tell their own story and not just be credited or edited to fit in the story is, I find, a really simple but powerful way to get the essence of the plight. And a couple of years ago, I visited a town in Colombia called La Ciudad de las Mujeres, the City of Women. It's led by a human rights lawyer called Patricia Guerrero, and the town had been built by a group of women displaced by the internal war in the country. Many had lost their husbands or had suffered abuse or violence, and Patricia had educated them about their rights and raised funds to buy land and build over 100 homes, build a city, a small town. In situations where there is human need, often there can be expectation that the Western media, that the coverage that we provide can make a radical difference to their plight. But the reality is not always like that. Human rights and development stories don't often get the front page or mass distribution. And when they do, often the coverage can peter out when there's nothing new to tell. But what the women did know was that the more visible they were, the safer they were. The more international press, or indeed any press they got, the more likely that the Colombian government would be held accountable for their safety and would want to toe the line when it came to their requests for reparations. It's one of those scenarios, like many others I could mention, that although it may seem like there is nothing left to tell, the story does need to keep getting told over and over again. In the case of City of Women, the coverage has helped to raise profile and has become an example model for other displaced groups around the world. And when Patricia Guerrero received a humanitarian award, I received a letter of thanks for a very, very small part in their journey. Since their work began, the landscape in Colombia has, of course, changed, but the struggle for those women continues. They still have to face the trauma of displacement and what they went through, and telling their story can inspire and make a difference to others who may be going through the same ordeal. And in the coming years, I hope that women's voices can continue to take center stage that way, but for all people in appalling situations to be given the chance to tell their story in their own words and using their own voices. I see that I'm not there to tell the story I wish in the way I want to tell it, with the technology I may have access to, but be there to listen and to let humans speak for themselves so that others can listen, hear about their lives from their perspective, because everyone has a story to tell. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.